Frame generation is some impressive technology. The fact that it's possible to interpolate frames together in real time is amazing. FSR 3.1 frame generation had recently came out, with more improvements to their upscaler, as well as making it possible to use their frame generation method along with other upscalers. AMD has really focused on making their upscaler as open as possible. While all of this is great, I want to bring attention to a better method of improving a game's perceived performance, because frame generation has many problems. 1. Latency. Because FrameGen relies on the latest frame and an earlier frame to interpolate them together, the game has to wait for that next frame, which increases latency. 2. Compatibility. While AMD has tried their hardest to make FrameGen available to everyone, there are some components that just can't run it because of how demanding frame generation is. Frame generation has also been used to make misleading advertisements. I'm looking at you, NVIDIA. And this is where my next argument comes in. What if I told you that there's a rendering technique out there that can result in a smoother gaming experience than frame generation, it doesn't add any extra latency, and it's capable of running on almost any graphics card? Yes, really. The rendering method I'm talking about is called Async Reprojection, and I'll be showing it off today by using this Minecraft mod made by MT1006. If you want to try this Async Reprojection mod for yourself, I left a link in the video's description down below. Before you install that mod though, I want to make it clear that this mod was supposed to be a demonstration, which is what the developer stated in the mod's description. There are many known issues with it, one of them being that you can't play the game in full screen mode, but other than that, this mod is a great demonstration of async reprojection, and I recommend that you try it so that you'll have a deeper understanding of how async reprojection works. But with all that said, let's get into it. In short, async reprojection is a rendering technique that separates your user inputs from the game's framerate, which results in a smoother and more responsive experience. It is able to make 60 FPS gameplay feel like it's running at 240 FPS or higher, depending on the maximum refresh rate of your monitor. But how exactly does it work? Essentially what it does is it takes the current frame that you are looking at and then splits that frame into multiple 2D layers. What this does is you can then move these layers around, which creates the illusion of a new perspective, and also the illusion of more frames. When this is implemented, it results in a gaming experience that feels nearly perfect in smoothness and responsiveness. If you are watching this slowed down footage of async reprojection, you can probably see the first issue with this technique. Whenever my camera moves even a little bit, you can see a black box at the edges of my screen, but there's a very simple fix for this. If you enable Clamp to Edge in the mod settings, the borders will now be stretched, which fills in the empty space. While it's not a perfect solution, it is surprisingly convincing, and when you're watching it in real time, it's even harder to spot. You can also hide this artifact by simply cropping into the frames. The only problem with this is that you will lose resolution, but the benefit is that the border stretching is nearly gone. With these things combined, it results in an experience that feels nearly flawless without any noticeable microstutters. There are also some other settings in the mod that you may want to check out. In the settings, there is the Ray Marching Iterations slider, as well as two other sliders below it. These sliders increase the amount of layers that the geometry will be split into, as well as shortening the distance between these layers. If you max out the layer count and make the layer separation as short as possible, it should result in a higher quality reprojected frame. Increasing the layer count improves the quality of the async reprojection when it's running at lower frame rates. Speaking of lower frame rates, there's another slider that forces the game to run at less than 10 FPS, and when the game runs at this low of a frame rate, you can see how the layers separate from each other as it's attempting to approximate what these in-between frames should look like. As you can see, the result doesn't look great, but what's amazing is that it looks smooth, and this is one advantage that this method has against frame generation. Frame generation can only double your frame rate, while async reprojection is able to interpolate camera movements way more effectively. While async reprojection looks better in almost every way, I want to talk about its disadvantages. One thing that async reprojection cannot handle is moving objects. Remember what I said about it improving the responsiveness of your inputs? Because it can only do this one thing, any moving objects that are in the scene will appear like they're running at a lower frame rate. This means that async reprojection only works with static objects. If you're watching this slow down footage of a villager in a minecart, it's clear that the villager is moving at a much lower frame rate than my camera's movements. That's because the game's base frame rate is running at only 30 FPS, and unfortunately, this jittery movement occurs with all moving objects, and the only way to fix this is to run the game at a higher frame rate. But doing that kinda defeats the purpose of this method, because it was designed to make the game more responsive, since your GPU cannot run the game at a higher frame rate. But there is an even worse problem with this technique: transparency. Because async reprojection works by reprojecting the current frame into the split up geometry, transparent objects like glass end up being rendered incorrectly. When you move around a glass block, the background of the glass ends up looking jittery because it cannot separate the background from the transparent texture. This only happens with partially transparent blocks though. Regular glass works fine because it's able to surgically cut out the sections of the texture that are fully transparent, but partially opaque blocks like stained glass have these issues. Also, if the game had reflections, the same jitteriness would occur with these reflections as well. So, async reprojection has a lot of problems, and it's probably the reason why it hasn't been widely adopted across many AAA games. But it's not all bad news for async reprojection though. If the game that it's implemented in has very simple graphics like Minecraft, I think that async reprojection would work great inside of it. And it may also be possible to combine frame generation with async reprojection so that you benefit from both things. You'd get some pretty insane performance gains with those two things combined. And there's one last thing that I want to bring up about frame generation. Intel, with their XeSS upscaler, had proposed another frame generation technique called frame extrapolation. Instead of frame interpolation, their method actually predicts what the next frame will look like. This, in theory, should result in frame generation, but without any added latency. I think that technique, along with async reprojection, would be a great combination. But anyway, I hope that this video informed you about async reprojection, and it's a topic that I'm really excited about. I want to make more videos like this to inform others about different things that deserve more attention. But that's all I have to say for this video, and before you leave, go check out their async reprojection mod. I'm sure that the mod creator would like the attention.